federal judge rules the shooting death of an unarmed man at the hands of a former South Carolina police officer is second-degree murder, not manslaughter. After making that decision, the judge sentenced Michael Slagger to 20 years in prison.
Cops know exactly how prison works. They've sent enough people there. But once they're the ones behind bars, the rules change instantly. The badge is gone, the power is gone, and suddenly they're the targets. That's when the nightmare begins.
A former police officer, a widely known dirty cop, has been killed by fellow inmates in a sudden attack. Instant karma behind bars.
From violent ambushes that left them scarred for life, to savage stabbings that nearly killed them, this is what really happens to dirty cops in prison. Number 6. Gerard John Schaefer.
Any of you cops out there think that I am involved in any crime in your jurisdiction, come to me. I will take a polygraph. I will take the test. You can take my fingerprints, whatever you want to do. I'll cooperate.
On July 21st, 1972, Hutchinson Island in Florida became the scene of a nightmare. Two teenage hitchhikers, 18-year-old Nancy Ellen Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Sue Wells, were picked up by Martin County Deputy Gerard John Schaefer, in uniform, with a badge. He looked like the safest choice they could make. But instead of taking them where they needed to go, he drove them into the woods, tied ropes around their necks, and balanced them on tree roots above swampy water. He told them it was all to teach them a lesson about hitchhiking. He left them there, certain they would slip and hang. But the girls fought like hell against the cuffs and gags, and by some miracle they got free and made it to the highway. When officers found them, they both pointed straight to Schaefer. He was fired on the spot and arrested. He later pleaded guilty to aggravated assault. His punishment was just 1 year in jail, with parole possible after 6 months starting on January 15, 1973. He called it a stupid mistake, but nobody was buying that. What made it even more chilling was that months earlier, 2 other girls had vanished. 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup had left home in Fort Lauderdale with a man Susan's mother had introduced them to. That was September 27, 1972. They never came back. For months, there were no answers until April 1, 1973, when a father and son out collecting cans stumbled on a shallow grave in what's now Oak Hammock Park in Port St. Lucie. The hole was only about 2 feet 3 inches deep, about 212 feet off a dirt road. Inside were 2 bodies. There were deep scrape marks on the nearby tree. It was the same twisted setup Trotter and Wells had survived. On April 5th, medical examiners confirmed it was Susan and Georgia. Detectives zeroed in on Schaefer. They hit his mother's house and found 300 pages of violent stories and sketches. At his own place, they found knives, guns, and Georgia's suede purse, something he had actually handed to his wife as if it were a normal gift. They even found human teeth later tied to another missing girl. The rope fibers and tree roots sealed the pattern. Add to that Susan's mother identifying Schaefer and remembering his license plate, and the police had their man. On May 18, 1973, just weeks before Schaefer could walk free from county jail, he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began on September 17, 1973. Prosecutors Robert Stone and Philip Shaler didn't just present bodies, they tied his whole method together. Jurors saw the rope-scarred tree limbs brought right into the courtroom. They heard the surviving girls testify that Schaefer had bragged he could dig a hole and nobody would ever find them. They even read one of his own manuscripts on how to properly execute women. After just 5 hours of deliberation on September 27th, the jury convicted him on both counts. The death penalty was off the table in Florida at the time, so the judge gave him 2 life sentences. But prison didn't shut him up. Schaefer leaned into the role of a criminal mastermind, cranking out writings from his cell, including Killer Fiction, a book co-published with crime writer Sandra London. He bragged about murders, tossed out body counts that kept changing, then claimed it was all just stories. Nobody believed him. Other inmates despised him. Guards whispered he was a snitch. He became a target, garbage thrown into his cell, fires lit to burn him alive. On December 3, 1995, it all caught up. Guards found Schaefer dead on the floor of his cell at Florida State Prison. He had been stabbed more than 40 times. His throat was slashed, his ribs broken, and one eye was destroyed. Another inmate, Vincent Faustino Rivera, was convicted of the killing and got more than 53 years added to his life sentence. Officials claimed it started over a petty fight about hot water, but most knew the truth. Schaefer's crimes and his reputation finally came due. He was 49 years old. Even in death, he didn't stop haunting people. In 2022, investigators used genetic genealogy to put a name to a 1974 Jane Doe, 15-year-old Suzanne Gale Poole. Her murder matched Schaefer's method and dumping grounds. Number 5. Jason Van Dyke. On October 20th, 2014, the southwest side of Chicago turned into a scene that the city would spend more than a year trying to bury. Police rolled up near 41st and Pulaski after a call about a teen breaking into trucks. That teen was 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. He was walking straight down the middle of the street, holding a small knife at his side. Several officers were already trailing him, keeping their distance, even calling for a taser to stop him safely. Then Jason Van Dyke pulled up. He barely stepped out of his squad car before pulling his gun. Within about 6 seconds, he opened fire, and over the next 14 to 15 seconds, he unloaded 16 shots. Laquan spun, collapsed onto the pavement, and most of the shots were fired after he was already on the ground. None of the other officers fired once. At first, official reports painted Laquan as aggressive, claiming he had charged at officers. But when the dashcam footage was finally forced into the light, it told a different story. Laquan wasn't charging. He was moving away when Van Dyke opened fire. That truth set off a chain reaction that Chicago officials tried to control. The city locked the video down for 13 months. Behind closed doors, the city council quietly approved a $5 million settlement with Laquan's family in April 2015, before a lawsuit was even filed. Aldermen weren't even allowed to see the video themselves, but freelance journalist Brandon Smith and activist William Calloway sued to force it out under public records law. On November 19, 2015, Judge Franklin Valderrama ordered the release. Hours before the video dropped, State's Attorney Anita Alvarez filed first-degree murder charges against Jason Van Dyke, the first time in decades a Chicago cop had faced murder charges for an on-duty shooting. When the video finally hit the news, it was explosive. Crowds packed downtown, chanting 16 shots as they marched up Michigan Avenue. Protests spread, and the case grabbed the nation's attention. It forced the Department of Justice to launch a civil rights investigation. By January 2017, that probe revealed what many already knew. Chicago police had a long-running pattern of excessive force and almost no accountability. The fallout helped push the city into a federal consent decree in 2019, meant to overhaul the entire department. Van Dyke himself was no stranger to complaints. Depending on the database, he had racked up at least 18, maybe 20, citizen complaints over his career, many tied to excessive force. Analysts later ranked him among the worst officers in the department. The warning signs were flashing long before October 2014, yet nothing was done. By 2018, the criminal trial was ready to begin. Special prosecutor Joseph McMahon took the lead. Jurors watched the dashcam footage over and over, frame by frame. Prosecutors hammered the timeline. Van Dyke started shooting only 6 seconds after arriving and kept firing for about 12.5 seconds while Laquan was already down. A defense psychologist even testified that Van Dyke had said on the way to the scene, "We're going to have to shoot the guy." On October 5, 2018, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and all 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. Sentencing came on January 18, 2019. Judge Vincent Gaughan gave Van Dyke 81 months. That's 6 years and 9 months, based on the murder charge, not the battery counts. With Illinois' day-for-day good conduct rule, he would serve only about half. Shackles went on, and he was sent straight into custody. Life inside was exactly what you'd expect for an ex-cop convicted in one of the most infamous cases in the country, dangerous. Just 4 days after his intake in Cook County, officials moved him to Rock Island County for his safety. Not long after, he was transferred into federal custody and sent out of state. By early February, at the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, another inmate jumped him, landing multiple punches. His injuries were minor, but the point was clear. He was a target. Van Dyke was placed under protective custody and kept away from the general population. Prison records later showed he was shuffled from place to place, including Otisville in New York and a Maryland federal unit, before eventually returning to Illinois control. No matter where he landed, the story was the same: heavy isolation, constant monitoring, and separation from other inmates. On February 3, 2022, Van Dyke walked out of prison after serving about half his sentence. Chicago braced for backlash. The mayor at the time admitted the punishment was too short, but reminded the public that the conviction itself was historic. For the first time in about 50 years, a Chicago police officer had been convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting. Just 2 months later, U.S. Attorney John Lausch announced that there would be no federal civil rights charges on top of the state case, saying the evidence wasn't strong enough for another trial. Number 4. Drew Peterson. On October 28, 2007, the quiet Chicago suburb of Bolingbrook turned into the backdrop of a story that shocked the nation. Drew Peterson's fourth wife, 23-year-old Stacy Peterson never showed up to meet a friend and disappeared without a trace. At first, it looked like just another missing person case, but when police started looking into Drew, the longtime cop with a big mouth, an even bigger ego, and a history of needing to control every situation, they uncovered something far darker. 3 years earlier, his third wife, 40-year-old Kathleen Savio, had been found dead on March 1, 2004. She was lying face down in a dry bathtub with a deep gash on her head and bruises across her body. Back then, the coroner's jury brushed it off as an accident. But now, with Stacy gone, Kathleen's body was exhumed, and the new autopsy told a different story. This wasn't an accident. It was a homicide. That one decision flipped Drew Peterson's life upside down. Detectives started chasing leads. Pastor Neil Shorey came forward and said Stacy had confided in him that Drew admitted to killing Kathleen and staging it to look like she slipped in the tub. Others said Stacy even covered for Drew the night Kathleen died. Investigators also believed Drew had tried to control the original crime scene, making himself look clean while pulling strings behind the scenes. A state grand jury heard the evidence, and on May 7, 2009, troopers pulled Drew over and arrested him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. A judge set his bond at $20 million, an amount so high there was no way he was getting out. Drew pled not guilty, but the walls were already closing in. The biggest fight before trial is over what the jury will be allowed to hear. Kathleen and Stacy can't take the stand, but their words hang heavy. Illinois has a hearsay rule, along with a doctrine that states if you silence a witness, their voice can still come in. After years of hearings, the judge rules those statements are fair game. Jurors will hear Kathleen's chilling warnings. He's going to kill me and make it look like an accident. They'll also hear Stacy's words to her pastor, saying Drew confessed to her. Finally, in 2012, the trial opened in Joliet. Prosecutors laid out the medical evidence, the dry tub, the head wound, the bruises, and then played the voices of Kathleen and Stacy through those statements. The defense fought hard, calling the hearsay unreliable and insisting the first inquest jury had been right. But on September 6, 2012, after weeks of gripping testimony, the jury came back with a guilty verdict for the murder of Kathleen Savio. Sentencing day came on February 21, 2013, and Drew tried to steal the spotlight. He stood up in court and shouted, "I did not kill Kathleen!" But the drama didn't matter. The judge gave him 38 years. At 59 years old, it was essentially a life sentence. Of course, Drew appealed. In 2017, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the conviction, saying the evidence and the hearsay rulings were solid. A year later, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to even hear it. Stacy Peterson is still missing to this day, officially considered a possible homicide, but no one has ever been charged. Prison didn't stop Drew from causing trouble. In 2015, while serving time at Menard Correctional Center, he tried to hire someone to kill Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow, the very prosecutor who put him behind bars. The scheme was caught on tape by another inmate and an undercover agent. In 2016, a jury convicted him of solicitation of murder, and the judge stacked 40 more years on top of the 38 he was already serving. The very next day, the Bolingbrook Police Pension Board stripped him of his $79,000 a year pension, and courts later confirmed he would never get it back. Because of the murder-for-hire plot, Illinois transferred him into federal custody in February 2017 for security reasons. He ended up at USP Terre Haute in Indiana. Within weeks, another inmate attacked him in the chow hall with a food tray. Drew wasn't seriously injured, but prison officials quickly pulled him from general population. By December 2019, officials moved him again under an interstate compact to a state facility outside Illinois. His location has never been disclosed for safety. He still files motions and occasionally gives interviews, always in Number 3, Ali Dizaei. On July 18, 2008, outside Yas, a Persian restaurant in Kensington, West London, an argument over a few £100 set off a chain of events that brought down one of the Metropolitan Police's most powerful men. Ali Dizaei wasn't just any man in the street. He was a high-ranking Metropolitan Police commander, one of the very few officers of Iranian descent to rise that high in the force. Wad al-Baghdadi, a young web designer, confronted him and demanded £600 for building him a website. Words flew inside the restaurant and spilled out onto the pavement, captured in fragments by CCTV. Then Dizaei snapped. He cuffed Baghdadi, radioed for backup, and filed reports claiming that Baghdadi had jabbed him in the stomach with a metal shisha pipe mouthpiece, leaving him scared for his safety. Doctors later looked at the so-called injury and said it didn't match the story. That was the crack that tore his career apart. Dizaei wasn't some rookie with a bad day. He joined Thames Valley Police back in 1986, transferred to the Met in 1999, and rose quickly. By 2008, he was a commander, one of the highest ranks in the force. He wasn't just climbing the ladder, he was visible, outspoken, and a top figure in the National Black Police Association. He made headlines for calling out racism in policing, but his past was messy. 8 years earlier, he'd been the target of Operation Helios, a massive anti-corruption probe that dragged on for years, only to collapse in disgrace. The Independent Police Complaints Commission later called it seriously flawed, and the Met even apologized to him. To some, the new charges in 2009 looked like payback. To others, they confirmed that the man had dodged accountability for too long. By May 2009, prosecutors charged him with misconduct in public office and perverting the course of justice. It wasn't about gangsters or drugs. It was about using the badge to settle a personal score, then lying to back it up. His trial opened in January 2010. Jurors heard how a petty 600-pound bill spiraled into a false arrest and fake injuries. On February 8th, they found him guilty. The judge said it was a serious breach of trust and sentenced him to 4 years. He was suspended immediately and fired the next month. But Dizaei wasn't finished. He appealed, pointing to problems with Baghdadi's background and identity. In June 2010, the Court of Appeal refused. Then new information surfaced. Baghdadi had been involved in benefit fraud and lied about parts of his identity. In May 2011, judges threw out the conviction, not because Dizaei was innocent, but because the jury hadn't been told enough about the witness's credibility. They ordered a retrial. That same day, Dizaei walked free from Leyhill Open Prison on bail, swearing he would clear his name. The retrial opened in January 2012. Baghdadi admitted to his lies and fraud, but prosecutors pressed forward with medical evidence showing Dizaei had exaggerated, maybe even faked, his injuries. On February 13th, the jury convicted him again. This time he was sentenced to 3 years. Prison life was brutal. After his first sentencing, he started at HMP Wandsworth, one of London's toughest jails. Because he was a high-profile ex-cop, he was quickly moved to HMP Edmonds Hill in Suffolk for safety. It didn't help. Inmates dumped a bucket of slop on him, then one of them punched him to the ground. Guards dragged him out and locked him in solitary confinement. From there, he was moved again and again, shuttled like cargo. By summer 2010, he was in open or part-open jails like Prescott and Usk in Wales, and later Leyhill in Gloucestershire, places thought easier to control. Even there, trouble followed. He reported racist threats. There was a cell fight that staff reviewed as an assault. He kept saying he was a target. The pattern never changed. Constant transfers, isolation from other inmates, and barely any time in general population. After his 2012 reconviction, the same routine repeated. Custody, protective segregation, then release on license because of time already served. By early 2013, with the Court of Appeal's final ruling, the case was finished. Dizaei still claimed he was a victim, saying he had been targeted for speaking out. But the prison files showed a man constantly shuffled around like a chess piece, because a disgraced ex-commander who abused his badge was the kind of prisoner others wanted to break. Number 2. Derek Chauvin. On May 25, 2020, outside Cup Foods in Minneapolis, a teenager pulled out her phone and pressed record. What she caught on camera would change the world. The video showed Derek Chauvin, a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis police, pinning George Floyd face down on the pavement with his knee on Floyd's neck and back. It lasted for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. During that time, Floyd begged for his life, saying over and over that he couldn't breathe. The clip went viral within hours, and it immediately destroyed the police department's first statement that tried to brush it off as a medical incident. The county medical examiner later ruled Floyd's death a homicide caused by neck and chest compression. Homicide by asphyxia, and the teenager who filmed it, Darnella Frazier, would later receive a special Pulitzer Prize citation for her courage. Chauvin wasn't some cop with a perfect record who suddenly lost control. His history was full of red flags. Over his career, he had racked up at least 17 or 18 complaints, including excessive force, and he had been involved in multiple shootings. Almost none of it had led to serious discipline. When the world saw the Floyd video and then learned about Chauvin's past, the pressure to act was enormous. Just 4 days after the killing, on May 29th, Chauvin was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Less than a week later, on June 3rd, the state attorney general raised the charge to second-degree unintentional murder and added charges against the other 3 officers at the scene for aiding and abetting. The trial that followed was unlike anything America had seen in years. Starting in March of 2021, cameras broadcast every moment. Jurors watched the bystander video and body cam footage again and again. Prosecutors repeated the key number, 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the time Chauvin pressed down on Floyd. Doctors testified that the pressure cut off his ability to breathe. Even Minneapolis's own police chief told the jury that Chauvin's knee restraint broke department rules. On April 20th, 2021, after just 10 hours of deliberation, the jury found Chauvin guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. 2 months later, Judge Peter Cahill sentenced him to 22.5 years, citing the cruelty of the act, the abuse of power, and the fact that children witnessed it all unfold. But Chauvin's legal troubles didn't stop there. In December of 2021, he also pleaded guilty in a federal case to violating George Floyd's civil rights, and even admitted to doing the same thing to a teenager back in 2017. In July of 2022, a federal judge gave him 21 years to run at the same time as his state sentence. That deal also allowed him to serve time in federal custody, which is safer for ex-cops. He first stayed at Minnesota's high-security Oak Park Heights prison, locked in a cell for about 23 hours a day. Later, he was moved to federal custody at FCI Tucson in Arizona, a medium-security prison. Life inside was far from normal. Chauvin lived under strict protective rules, separated from most inmates, because everyone knew what he had done, and that made him a constant target. But even that wasn't enough. On November 24th, 2023, the day after Thanksgiving, another inmate attacked him in the law library and stabbed him 22 times. The attacker, 52-year-old John Turskak, later admitted he chose that date because of Black Friday and its tie-in to Black Lives Matter. Chauvin barely survived after emergency medical treatment, and prosecutors charged Turskak with attempted murder. After the attack, officials quickly transferred Chauvin. By August 2024, reports confirmed he had been moved to FCI Big Spring in Texas to reduce the risk of another strike. That's where he remains, locked away and heavily watched. Meanwhile, his lawyers kept pushing appeals. In April 2023, Minnesota's Court of Appeals upheld his conviction. That July, the state Supreme Court refused to hear his case. By November, the U.S. Supreme Court also said no. In late 2024, a Minnesota judge even allowed limited testing of preserved tissue after Chauvin claimed new evidence might clear him. None of it changed the outcome. Number 1. Michael Thomas Slagger. On April 4, 2015, in North Charleston, South Carolina, a simple traffic stop turned into one of the most infamous police shootings the country has ever seen. Officer Michael Slagger pulled over 50-year-old Walter Scott, who was driving a 1991 Mercedes with a busted brake light. At first, it looked routine. Scott handed over his information like anyone else would. But then, out of nowhere, Scott bolted from the car and took off running. The dash cam caught the traffic stop, but not what came after. The chase went behind a pawn shop, where things quickly spiraled. Slagger fired his taser. There was a brief scuffle, and Scott broke free again, sprinting away. That's when bystander Fiden Santana pulled out his phone and pressed record. What he captured changed everything. His video showed Slagger raising his gun and firing 8 times as Scott ran about 15 to 20 feet ahead of him. 5 bullets hit, 3 tore into his back, 1 hit his buttocks, and 1 grazed his ear. As Scott dropped to the ground, Slagger got on the radio, claiming Scott had taken his taser. But Santana's camera told a different story. It caught Slagger picking something up and dropping it near Scott's body, almost as if to stage the scene. The coroner ruled Scott's death a homicide, and within days, Slagger was fired and hit with a murder charge. That cell phone video blew apart the first official reports, and the case exploded nationally. State investigators, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division all launched parallel investigations. By October of that same year, North Charleston City Council voted unanimously, 10-0, to give Scott's family a $6.5 million settlement. Santana's footage, the dash cam, and the autopsy results became the backbone of the case against Slagger. His first trip to trial came in state court in late 2016. After 5 weeks of evidence, the jury deadlocked. They simply couldn't agree, and the judge declared a mistrial. But Slagger's troubles were far from over. Back in May 2016, a federal grand jury had already indicted him on civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and using a firearm in a violent crime. Facing the weight of both state and federal cases, Slagger took a deal. On May 2, 2017, he pled guilty to 1 federal charge, deprivation of rights under color of law. In return, prosecutors dropped the other counts, and the state agreed not to retry him for murder. In court, Slagger admitted what millions had already seen with their own eyes, that shooting Walter Scott was objectively unreasonable. Sentencing happened that December and lasted 4 full days. Federal Judge David Norton ruled the crime should be treated as second-degree murder and tacked on obstruction because of Slagger's lies about what happened after the shooting. The final punishment was 20 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. In the federal system, there is no parole, so 20 years meant 20 years. After sentencing, he was moved into federal custody. The Bureau of Prisons shipped him to FCY Englewood, a low-security prison just outside Denver known for housing ex-cops and other high-profile inmates. Even before he landed there, while he was still in county jail, staff treated him like a marked man. Ranges were cleared whenever he was moved, because a disgraced officer in on a murder charge is always a target. At Englewood, he has lived under protective custody rules, tucked away from the general population, serving his time quietly with no way out, other than the slow tick of the calendar. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.